Hi there and welcome once again to the Explaining History podcast, and in this episode I'm going to be talking about the development of the atomic bomb during the Second World War. By 1945 the United States had a monopoly on nuclear power. This they ably demonstrated on the 25th of July 1946 by the detonation of the first underwater atomic bomb at Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. The journalist James Cameron was there, and he was a British wartime correspondent and very famous investigative journalist post-war, and he wrote an account. Stood on the USS Appalachian, 8 miles away, he wrote, "It came gently, imperceptibly to begin with. One's heightened senses seemed somehow to decelerate that first subdivided second until one saw the gradual maturing of an instantaneous thing. There across the field of the lens's view stretched the bowstring horizon of the Pacific. Where this ruled edge met the sky came the flash, then a ball, a gleaming hemisphere of purest white, a grotesque and momentary bubble, huge and growing huger, a dome rising from the sea, now a column, a pillar of water more than half a mile across, 1,000,000 tons of the Pacific leaping vertically, silently, soaring upwards into the cloud base, 1 mile, 2 miles high, until it hesitated, dropped lazily back like a mountainous snowman into the terrible cauldron of the Bikini Lagoon, now a waste of murk and fog. In that initial moment the battleship Arkansas had been tossed into the air like a tiny toy, thrown vertically up and over. There was a feeling of this enormous water dome swelling and expanding in perfect symmetry to a monstrous bulk, that it would never stop developing, that it would increase indefinitely and overwhelm us, and not only us, but everybody. Then the outward movement became an upward one, where the ineffable grace of the column, the weary slowness with which it dripped its 1,000,000 tons back towards the lagoon. Some assorted German and Japanese and American warships had been left in order to be part of the experiment in the area of effect of the bomb. And the detonation itself told Allied scientists very little that they didn't already know. It was largely a waste of time from any actual testing point of view. The point of the detonation was perhaps more propagandistic than it was investigatory. It was a way of showing the world that America intended to continue with its atom bomb program, and that it had no intention of ridding itself of its nuclear arsenal after the detonation of the 2 atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. America in 1945 didn't have a sufficiently large nuclear arsenal in order to eliminate the Soviet Union, and the pretense that it did was more useful than the actual possibility of an attack. In reality, there was no political desire in Truman's administration to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. Perhaps had there been an invasion of Western Europe by the Red Army, that might have been rather different. But it was knowledge of the American nuclear arsenal that stayed Stalin's hand. There had been all sorts of plans that Stalin had of marching as far as the English Channel, which would have been eminently doable had the Red Army decided. But America was presented with a rather unique problem. Normally, countries without diplomatic leverage struggle to gain the economic or the military means to get that leverage. In the case of the United States had been given that leverage, and many times over, or had acquired that leverage many times over, and yet was uncertain about what actually to do with it. Stalin was adamant when the atomic bomb was dropped that it was vital that the Soviet Union did not appear intimidated, that they could look upon the atomic bomb, as Mao described it as a paper tiger. When Stalin spoke to Alexander Wirth, who had spent part of the war in Leningrad, right? So I've got a book on his recollections on Leningrad that we reviewed it a while ago. He was asked by Wirth, this is 1947, do you believe that virtual monopoly by the USA of the atom bomb one of the main dangers to peace? Stalin replied, I do not believe the atom bomb to be as serious a force as certain politicians are inclined to think. Atom bombs are intended for intimidating the weak-nerved, but they cannot decide the outcome of war, since atom bombs are by no means sufficient for this purpose. Certainly, monopolistic possession of the secret of the atom bomb does create that threat, but at least two remedies exist against it. A. Monopolist possession of the atom bomb cannot last long, and B. Use of the atom bomb will be prohibited. Stalin was certainly working towards outcome A. He was developing his own bomb project. We discussed this previously. But also, as far as outcome B went, Stalin had no confidence that international legality could be used to constrain the United States. He thought that perhaps the United Nations could be twisted to Soviet advantages in certain regards, but he didn't trust the United Nations itself or the international system of rules, which he saw as being created by capitalist powers, really for the constraint of countries like the Soviet Union. So Truman's problem when dealing with Stalin is that he did have the trump card of the atomic bomb, but there was precious little he could do with it. Using it against the Soviets would have caused an international outrage and would have devastated America's world standing, which America at the time understood to be a key part of US power, what we'd call soft power. The idea that essentially the United States had been on the right side during the war was at least in 1945 generally highly thought of around the world, having defeated Japan and being part of the coalition that defeated Germany. The British and the Americans had deliberately excluded the Soviets from any kind of wartime cooperation on the development of the atomic bomb. In September 1944, Churchill met Roosevelt at Roosevelt's estate on the Hudson River at Hyde Park, and minutes of the meeting said, the suggestion that the world should be informed regarding tube alloys, which was always the code name for the Manhattan Project, with a view to international agreement regarding the control and use of it, is not accepted. The matter should continue to be regarded as the one of utmost secrecy. Of course, Churchill saw the atomic bomb as a way of giving the British Empire a shot in the arm and a natural long stay of execution or lease of life. He knew full well that the post-war environment for the British Empire was going to be bleak indeed, and that the empire, 2 world wars, had shaken the empire to its core. Having an atomic bomb would continue to allow Britain to punch above its weight and to be at the top table of international affairs. And indeed, it has done in the post-war era, as Britain's significance and economic, diplomatic and military clout has gradually declined. Nuclear power has maintained Britain's place on the United Nations Security Council alongside France, and given the British a role in international affairs that Britain's current status would normally not afford it. Dean Acheson, who was one of Truman's most important foreign policy advisors, spoke candidly to the president and said that essentially, if you keep these secrets from the Soviets, this will help define the Cold War that is clearly coming, the diplomatic and ideological standoff with the Soviet Union. If you retain between Britain and America nuclear secrets, the Soviets will only draw one conclusion from that you intend to use nuclear weapons against them at some point in the future. Tellingly, Acheson said, It is impossible that a government as powerful and power-conscious as the Soviet government could fail to react vigorously to this situation. And he later said more profoundly, the advantage of being ahead in such an arms race is nothing compared with not having the race in the first place. And so he saw the reality that cooperation with the Soviet Union would be far better than competition. The atomic bomb could not be uninvented. It could, however, be shared, and this would prevent there from being the possibility of war between two powers. That might seem awfully naive, but it was a view that was actually shared across both governments in certain regards. Some of the passing of nuclear information from British and American nuclear research defence establishments, such as the Soviet mole Melita Norwood, was done really because it was viewed by Soviet fellow travellers and actual Soviet agents that an American monopoly on nuclear power would be far more dangerous than being shared with the Soviet Union. Now, this is, of course, is to take a very naive view of Stalin, and naive views of Stalin abound in this period of time, not least because this was now 10 years or so following the purges, and in between time, the Soviet Union had defeated Nazism. The Soviet Union had something of a kind of a morally cleansing process during the Second World War. The reality that Stalinism was rapidly reasserting itself from 1943 onwards, and at the end of the Second World War, for a period of time, Stalinism was kind of revived, and Stalin's grip across the country was renewed, and that purges, particularly the cosmopolitan, the cosmopolitan campaign and the Doctor's plot, were commencing in the late 1940s. Stalin was trying his hand at an anti-Jewish action, which we'll talk about in greater depth another time, I think. These indicators from inside the Soviet Union were often missed or ignored or overlooked or unknown by external observers who thought that Stalin should be given nuclear technology. It was the view of Robert Oppenheimer, who was the lead physicist behind the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos in New Mexico, that nuclear research, materials and technology should be placed under the control of an international agency. And this would ensure that plutonium and thorium, which were used to make the weapons, would be controlled. Oppenheimer said, only if the dangerous aspects of atomic energy are taken out of national hands is there any reasonable prospect of devising safeguards against the use of atomic energy for bombs. Oppenheimer believed that the creation of nuclear fission could now be used for immense civilian gain, and that this would be part of the building of a new post-war world, rather naively, I suppose. But he was joined in that view by the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, who thought that both sides should have the technology to make the bombs. It was thought by both Churchill and Roosevelt that Bohr might actually help the Russians with their research. He didn't know everything that there was to know about the Manhattan Project, but he was aware of its existence, and he knew he knew people such as Oppenheimer and Fermi and Einstein, and was well acquainted with all the people who understood the technology, and was in a position to help the Soviets. This didn't happen. But when he approached and wrote to both Churchill and Roosevelt and urged them to share the technology with the Soviets, he became the subject of the intelligence community's intense interests, and there was a note at the between Churchill and Roosevelt that said, "Inquiries should be made regarding the activities of Professor Bohr, and steps should be taken to ensure that he is responsible for no leakages of information, particularly to the Russians." Bohr said basically that if weapons were shared and essentially pointed at one another, then they would be more likely to be renounced. The view that Truman had, and this was unfortunately perhaps a realistic view, was that this was idealistic and naive nonsense. The chiefs of staff surrounding Truman said that it would be ultimately treasonous to hand away a key weapon to a foreign power. And Stalin was under no illusions about this. He knew that they had not given him nuclear technology during the Second World War, when there was close military cooperation, and they certainly weren't going to start doing it now. Neither the Americans or the Soviets were interested in a nuclear treaty. The Americans didn't have to have one, they already had the bomb, and the Soviets believed that if they did come to a treaty agreement with the Americans, it would be on the basis that they would have to agree to not pursue nuclear technology, or at least not military nuclear technology, and they certainly weren't interested in that. In 1946, the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission was set up, which was a way of trying to civilianize or civilize, if you will, the technology, to take it out of military purposes and military processes. Obviously, this has not proved to be particularly successful, and the Americans and Soviets debated the beginnings of non-proliferation, which obviously would become far more important in the 60s and 70s and beyond. But America's offer to hold the atomic bomb in trust for all mankind, and in return for the Soviets renouncing any plans to acquire nuclear technology, was virtually laughed at by the Soviets. The Soviets said that America should make a point of dismantling its bombs and promising not to build any future ones, and this again was rejected by America. The detonation of the first underwater bomb at Bikini Atoll should be seen in the context of these discussions. It was a way, really, of America disrupting the discussions and showing that they had virtually no serious interest in abandoning the use of atomic weapons, or at least the possession of them. And there was evidence that America, whilst discussing in a half-hearted way about non-proliferation with the Soviets, were busy building and testing larger and larger and more powerful nuclear weapons. However, the Soviets were not the only power that America was in dispute with over the ownership of nuclear technology. The British, whom America had cooperated with and been allied to during the war, were also engaged in their own controversy with America. After the war, America ended the sharing of atomic secrets with Britain. The fact that British intelligence was riddled with Soviet spies, and that there was a flow of atomic secrets from London to Moscow, this was actually obviously unknown at the time, but it was fortuitous to America to end cooperation as well. There was also obviously a flow of atomic secrets direct from Los Alamos to the Soviet Union too, but that is kind of slightly by the by on this point. After VJ Day, British scientists returned home to Britain, and it was assumed that cooperation would continue. The weakened financial state of Great Britain at the end of the Second World War, and the desperation of the British to gain a loan, which they eventually do, to prevent Britain from collapsing into bankruptcy, at the end of the war meant that America could extract concessions from the British, and they do in the nuclear field. The British were anxious not to upset the delicate financial negotiations. If you go back and listen to my podcast on Keynes and the American loan, that will give you a strong picture as to exactly how fraught the situation was. But forcing the British out of the atomic loop was really a significant coup by the US. The British had contributed some expertise, but mainly the costs and the technical challenges were undertaken by the US. The agreement at Hyde Park between Churchill and Roosevelt had said that nuclear cooperation would continue after the war, but this was more of kind of a gentleman's agreement. There's nothing on paper per se. There was no signed treaty on this between the two countries. And in the immediate post-war era, there was far less enthusiasm. Now that Roosevelt was dead and Churchill was out of power, there's far less enthusiasm as American congressmen and senators, scientists, and business figures looked at what was really being presented to the British, and it was in their view, a free transfer of technology that would prop up an ailing competitor. And it was clear that atomic energy for industrial purposes was what the British were more interested in, though the British did want a bomb, and Ernest Bevin essentially said, we need the bomb with the Union Jack on it. But the worry that the Americans had was that Britain was going to become an obstacle to American economic hegemony in the post-war era, and it was not a good idea to enable this by transfers of nuclear technology. Of course, Britain doesn't become this and goes into a relative economic decline in the post-war years. Henry Stimson said to Truman that the British had no right to the achievements of American industry, that the Americans did 9/10 of the work, and this was largely true. The Americans had poured in tens of thousands of personnel on the Manhattan Project and invested billions of dollars. In Victor Sebastian's book 1946, he makes the point that one reason for the development of a British bomb was partly the threat of the Soviet Union, but also the need to end dependency on the USA. We must free ourselves of financial dependence on the US as soon as possible. We shall never be able to pull our weight unless we are. These were the words of Ernest Bevin, the foreign minister in the post-war Labour government led by Clement Attlee in 1946. There was obviously a huge economic cliff facing Britain in 1947 when currency controls were removed as part of a condition of the American loan. Though in 1946, whilst there appeared to be difficult financial times ahead, the level of crisis was as yet not anticipated. This is why discussions of atomic bombs were all the more feasible in 1946 than 1947. One of the big problems that each Labour government had encountered in the post-war era, all the way up to Harold Wilson and James Callaghan, was high defence spending and high welfare spending, matched with often poor productivity, poor management, and difficult labour relations, meant that the British economy found it very hard to pay these high bills. But in 1946, the readiness to adopt a nuclear programme was striking. The commitment that a notionally socialist government had to maintaining its place at the top table of international affairs and retaining imperial power with the new device of nuclear technology was curious in the absence of much debate about it. Hugh Dalton and Stafford Cripps thought that it was unaffordable, and the Cabinet Committee was told in 1946 that it would cost 30 to 40 million pounds more than the original estimate, which was an overspend of 15%. However, much of the much of the debate was kept secret from ministers, and planning for the British bomb went ahead. Britain was, as Ernest Bevin said, Britain could not afford to be left behind. Bevin, as I said previously, said, we've got to have the bloody thing, and we've got to have a bloody Union Jack flying on top of it. Okay, I'm going to finish there because I've gone on for way too long, but I hope you found that interesting and useful, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Thanks very much, bye-bye.